Colonel Rick Forrester had been to dozens of schools before. The decorated Air Force veteran, now serving in a public engagement role, was no stranger to classroom visits. He'd speak about flight, discipline, patriotism, hoping to inspire a spark in at least one kid. It was usually predictable. Students clapped, teachers smiled, and then he'd leave, not expecting much follow-up. But that day at Maple Ridge Elementary School would mark the start of a story he'd never forget. Ms. Jacobs, a bright-eyed fifth-grade teacher, welcomed him with a smile and a room full of buzzing students. They had been learning about aviation all week, and the colonel's visit was the highlight. After a brief introduction, Rick began his usual presentation, some slides about Air Force jets, videos of F-16s doing barrel rolls, and a few stories from his time overseas. The kids listened politely, giggling when he described throwing up in a G-suit after his first flight. But then came the hands-on activity. Rick loved this part. He handed out sheets of paper and challenged the kids to build the best paper airplane they could. The rules were simple. One throw, no do-overs. The farthest plane wins. The room buzzed with activity as little fingers folded, creased, and tweaked their designs. Some kids built simple darts. Others tried fancy wings and flaps. Rick strolled around, giving occasional tips. Sharper nose helps. Or, try folding the wings up a bit. The excitement built. Then he reached the back of the room, where a quiet girl named Lila Chun was working silently. Her desk was perfectly neat, and she seemed unusually focused. Her plane looked odd, longer wingspan, blunt nose, strange little awkward curls at the tips of the wings. Rick chuckled lightly. Interesting design, he said. Going for style points? Leela looked up, a bit startled. It flies better this way, she replied softly. He smiled, amused by her seriousness. Well, let's see if it can beat the classics. When the throwing began, most planes dove nose first or veered off. A few made it halfway across the classroom. The record so far belonged to a boy named Tyler. His plane landed near the teacher's desk, earning high fives from his friends. Then came Lila's turn. She stood up quietly, walked to the launch line, and gently released her plane. It lifted effortlessly, caught the air in a way no other had, and glided straight and smooth passing the teacher's desk and continuing all the way to the classroom door before gently touching down. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then, the classroom erupted. Whoa! Did you see that? She beat Tyler. Even Ms. Jacobs clapped. That was incredible, Lila. Rick blinked. He had tossed that same plane earlier, dismissively, and now he was watching it defy the room's expectations. He walked over, picked it up, and examined it again. It wasn't luck. The folds were intentional, balanced, precise. He looked back at Lila, who was now smiling faintly under the sudden spotlight. You designed this yourself? He asked. She nodded. I tested it a lot at home. Rick raised an eyebrow. Something about this girl stood out, not just her design, but her poise. Kids usually celebrated loudly when they won. She was calm, composed. Well, he said slowly, I've flown supersonic jets, but I've never seen a paper plane fly like that in a classroom. Lila's cheeks flushed pink. After the visit ended and the class returned to their routine, Rick lingered behind. He spoke quietly to Ms. Jacobs, asking more about the girl. She's quiet, the teacher said, but brilliant. She's obsessed with planes. Draws them, studies them, talks about them with her grandpa. It's like she was born to fly. Rick nodded slowly. Something told him this girl was more than just a curious kid. She had something rare. And while he had chuckled at first, like many others might, he was no longer laughing. He was intrigued. That paper plane? It wasn't just a classroom toy. It was a signal. A glimpse into something much bigger about to take flight. Asterisk Lila Chun wasn't used to being the center of attention. At home, she was known as the quiet one. At school, she was the girl who sat near the back, finished her homework early, and never raised her hand unless she was sure. Most people didn't notice her, and that was fine by her. But ever since Colonel Forrester's visit, something had shifted. Whispers followed her in the hallway. That's the girl with the plane. She beat Tyler with a weird design. She made the colonel look surprised. Lila tried to brush it off. Fame, even in a 5th grade classroom, wasn't her goal. Her real love was what happened after school. When she climbed up the rickety attic stairs to her grandfather's workshop. Her grandfather, Henry Chun, was a retired Navy aircraft mechanic. His garage was cluttered with old blueprints, dusty gauges, and yellowed manuals from decades past. To Lila, it was paradise. Every Saturday, she'd sit beside him, eyes wide as he told stories about fighter jets in the Pacific and how engines used to sound like thunder rolling through steel. He treated her like a fellow engineer, not like a kid. "You see this wing design?" he said one day, pointing to a P-51 Mustang blueprint. "It's beautiful, but it creates drag at high speed. Now what you did with those winglets on your paper. Plane? That's genius. You bent the tips upward like a Boeing 787. Do you even know why?" Lila nodded. "To reduce vortex drag and stabilize flight," he chuckled proudly. "My little barnstormer." Every night, Lila worked on new paper plane models, testing lift and balance by tossing them across the garage. She adjusted wingspans by millimeters, weighed down the nose with pennies, and logged every result in a spiral-bound notebook. She didn't think of it as learning. To her, it was discovery. Flight wasn't just a subject, it was a language. She spoke fluently, but others didn't always see it that way. During recess, while other kids played tag, Lila sat alone, sketching jet engines. A group of boys passed by, snickering. "She thinks she's a pilot now. Next she'll say she's flying to the moon." Lila said nothing. She just kept sketching. They didn't understand. But her grandfather did. And now so did Colonel Forrester. What Lila didn't know was that, after that classroom visit, the colonel hadn't just gone back to work and forgotten her. He'd stayed up late that night, poring over the sketches her teacher had scanned and emailed to him. Diagrams, formulas, tiny notes about airflow and drag coefficients, written in pencil, but with the precision of a first-year aerospace student. He couldn't believe it. This wasn't child's play. It was pre-engineering. He called in a favor. Years ago, Forrester had partnered with a private flight training organization called Skybright Young Aviators, a non-profit offering scholarships to promising students in aviation science. They had a competitive application process, but exceptions could be made for extraordinary talent. When he sent Lila's sketches and a brief letter of recommendation, the board responded within a day. She was in. The letter arrived on a rainy Thursday. Lila's mom handed it to her with a confused look. "Did you apply for something?" Lila opened the envelope, eyes scanning the bold blue logo, then the words, "Congratulations. You have been selected for the Skybright Young Aviators program." Her heart stopped. She read it twice, then a third time, just to be sure. It included a full scholarship tuition, travel, even a pair of flight goggles. Her parents were stunned. "Are you sure this isn't a mistake?" She handed them the colonel's signed letter at the bottom. It wasn't a mistake. It was the beginning of something real. Later that night, Lila sat on the roof of her house, notebook in her lap, rain tapping lightly on her hood. In her hand was the original paper plane, the same one Colonel Forrester had laughed at, then admired. She smiled. She didn't know exactly where this journey would take her. But one thing was certain. She was no longer just folding paper. She was building wings. Colonel Rick Forrester had seen hundreds of cadets over his career, bright-eyed dreamers, brilliant engineers, top-ranked pilots, but something about Lila Chun stuck in his mind like a song he couldn't stop humming. He'd visited her class. Yes, but her sketches haunted him more than the memory of that perfect paper flight. It wasn't just that she could fold a plane. It was that she thought like someone who had flown one. He printed her notebook pages and laid them out across his dining room table. He poured coffee. Then he poured another cup. There were calculations scrawled in the margins, notes comparing rudder control on different aircraft models, even sketches of potential jet engine layouts. She was, what, 10? 11? This wasn't cute. This was uncanny Doc, so he picked up the phone. David. He said to his old colleague at Skybright, "You ever heard of a fifth grader who folds planes like a Boeing engineer?" His friend laughed. "You seeing paper plane prodigies now, Rick?" "I'm serious. This kid's got something." Rick emailed Lila's scans over. Within an hour, David called back. "We need her in our program." "Already ahead of you." Rick said by the end of the week, Lila's spot was reserved. No application needed. It was an honorary invite, something Skybright only issued a few times a decade. The colonel personally paid her registration fee. Still, there was one obstacle. Left. Her parents. When Rick called Mr. and Mrs. Chun, he could hear the caution in their voices. They weren't against the opportunity, but they were wary. They were working-class folks, the kind who didn't take dreams for granted. Her mother worried about time, school, balance. Her father, a restaurant cook who barely had a moment to rest between shifts, asked the colonel a blunt question. Why her? Rick didn't hesitate. Because she has the kind of mind that changes industries, and the kind of heart that leads people. After a long silence, Lila's mother softly said, "She's always been different. We just didn't know if the world would accept it." "Maybe the world isn't ready," Rick replied, "but the sky is." With hesitant but hopeful hearts, they agreed. When Lila found out, she didn't scream or jump. She just sat on the couch with the envelope in her lap, reading it again and again. Her grandfather clapped so hard, he nearly knocked over his coffee. "We're going to get you in the sky, little ace," he said. "We're going to make that dream real." Skybright's summer session was held just outside of San Diego, a full month of aviation immersion. Students from across the country would train on real simulators, attend engineering labs, and even take co-pilot seats during flight sessions. Most were high schoolers. Lila would be one of the youngest students ever admitted. The day she arrived, clutching her beat-up backpack and wearing a borrowed windbreaker, she felt like an imposter. The other kids were older, louder, and far more confident. Some came from private academies. A few even had pilot parents. One boy laughed when she introduced herself. "You're the paper plane girl?" He smirked. "This isn't arts and crafts." Lila said nothing, but she took note of every face in that room. The first week was brutal. The instructors pushed them hard cockpit drills, radio call simulations, technical briefings on navigation and flight systems. But Lila absorbed it all like sunlight. She stayed up late memorizing FAA codes. She asked precise questions. She corrected an instructor once on an outdated wind shear chart. He double-checked. And she was right. By the end of week 2, the same boy who mocked her now sat beside her in every session, taking notes off her diagrams. Rick flew in secretly to observe the mid-session simulator evaluations. When he peeked through the control booth window and saw Lila guiding her plane through mock turbulence with steady hands and sharp decisions, he smiled. "She's not just good," the instructor whispered. "She's unreal," Rick nodded. He didn't laugh anymore. He was watching a future pilot take flight, not in the air yet, but in confidence, in skill, in something far rarer. In belief. Asterisk, by the time she was 13, Leela Chun had already logged more simulator hours than many first-year aviation students. What started as curiosity with paper planes had become muscle memory. Her fingers knew the layout of a Cessna cockpit better than her school science lab. And while her classmates worried about midterms and TikTok trends, Lila was memorizing radio procedures, runway patterns, and weather patterns. But passion wasn't enough. Flight demanded precision, discipline, and most of all, persistence. Sky, bright single quotes S mentorship continued through the year. Every Saturday, Lila rode her bike 5 miles to a small regional airport where volunteers from the program met with students. The hangars there were old, but the aircraft were lovingly maintained. Leela's favorite was a white and blue Piper Cherokee. It wasn't flashy, but it felt like home. The first time she climbed inside the real cockpit, she sat in the left seat and froze, not from fear but reverence. Her hands hovered over the yoke. The instructor, a stern woman named Captain Valerie Dunn, watched her quietly. "You've done this in a simulator," Val said. "Now it's real. Take the checklist." Lila's voice was steady. Pre-flight inspection complete. Fuel checked. Oil pressure green. Altimeter set. Val raised an eyebrow. Most kids stumbled over the basics. This one spoke like she'd been born on the runway. By the end of that first flight, Val was convinced. "This girl doesn't just want to fly," she told Rick Forrester. In an email, she was meant to fly. But outside the hangar, not everyone shared that enthusiasm. Some of the older cadets, especially the boys, grumbled behind her back. "Teacher's pet. Overachiever." One even muttered, "Probably just here because the colonel likes her." Lila heard it all. She didn't flinch. She'd spent her life being underestimated. Quiet, Asian, a girl, too small, too serious, too strange. Even her middle school counselor once gently suggested she explore more realistic goals when she said she wanted to become a fighter pilot. She didn't argue. She just kept studying. Back at home, her grandfather was her rock. He tuned engines in his garage and coached her through every airspeed concept. "Let your instincts fly, but don't let them take the stick," he said. "Feel the wind, but know the science." Every Sunday night, Lila would video call Colonel Forrester. They didn't talk like a student and mentor. It was more like fellow pilots. He sent her books, Chuck Yeager's biography, NASA Flight, manuals, and scribbled little notes in the margins. Page 142. What would you do in this stall scenario? One evening, she answered his question without hesitation. He nodded slowly. "You're not just reading these, are you?" "No, sir. I'm living them." By age 15, she had completed her FAA ground school requirements and passed her written exam with near-perfect scores. When she walked into the airport lounge after getting her results, Captain Val handed her a small envelope with a grin. "Next step, co-pilot flights. You're going up with me." Their first session took off from San Diego's Montgomery Field. Blue skies stretched overhead. Lila's palms were damp, but her voice on the radio was crisp. "Cherokee Niner 315 Hotel, requesting taxi. Clearance, eastbound departure." Captain Val turned to her after takeoff. "You've got the controls." Leela didn't speak. She just nodded, hands on the yoke, feet on the rudder pedals. The plane responded like it had been waiting for her. They flew along the coast, past cliffs and shimmering ocean. Val didn't speak for 5 minutes. Then she said, "You know what your face looks like right now?" Lila blinked. "What?" "Someone who just touched their dream." Back on the ground, Lila exhaled deeply. It had felt real. Not just in the controls or the view, but in her bones. She could do this. She would. She hadn't just taken her first flight. She had taken her first step into the sky that was waiting for her. By the time Lila turned 17, the sky had become her second home. She had flown as co-pilot on nearly 24 flights, mastered weather interpretation, and even trained in emergency procedures. All that remained between her and a private pilot's license was the final solo flight and officially logged. Instructor-approved journey under FAA guidelines. It was both a test and a milestone. A solo flight was more than skill. It was a statement. You're ready to take the controls of your life alone. The flight was scheduled for a Thursday in late spring. The forecast was mild, with just a slight chance of early afternoon showers. Lila arrived at the airfield by 6:30 a.m., her checklist folded in her pocket, hair tied back tightly, and a fresh copy of her flight plan under her arm. Her grandfather stood with her on the tarmac, one hand on her shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Barnstormer," he said quietly. "But remember, there's no shame in postponing if weather gets tricky. A smart pilot knows when to ground herself." She nodded, but her eyes were already scanning the sky. By 9 a.m., gray clouds began rolling in from the west. A few other student pilots canceled or delayed their flights. Even the instructors grew cautious. Captain Val reviewed the radar twice and frowned at the rising wind speeds. "Conditions are getting edgy," she said, looking at Lila. "You sure about this?" Lila looked toward the horizon. The clouds were thick, but not yet dangerous. Wind speeds hovered around tolerable limits. She thought about all the hours she had spent training for this. She thought about the kids who used to laugh at her, the counselor who once said she dreamed too big, and the colonel who had believed in her before anyone else. "Unsure," she said. "I've flown this route in the sim a dozen times." Val didn't try to talk her out of it. She knew Lila well enough by now. If she wasn't ready, she wouldn't even ask. "Then go," she said, "and trust yourself." Lila climbed into the Cherokee's cockpit, heart racing. She moved through the pre-flight checklist methodically, as if each box was a gear in a bigger machine. When the engine roared to life, her nerves quieted. This was her zone. Cherokee Niner 315 Hotel requesting clearance. She said into the headset, voice calm. "Cleared for takeoff," came the tower's reply. She taxied, turned into the wind, and lifted off. The first leg of the flight was smooth. As she rose above the low cloud cover, sunlight poured across the cockpit. She smiled, gripping the yoke gently, her shoulders relaxed. But 20 minutes in, everything changed. The wind shifted hard from the south, shaking the aircraft with unexpected turbulence. Pockets of air pushed and pulled at her wings. The clouds thickened. Visibility dropped. Her breathing quickened. For a moment, her mind flashed to the worst-case scenarios. But then she heard her grandfather's voice in her head. "Feel the wind, but don't let it take the stick." She refocused. Lila adjusted her heading to account for the crosswind. She dropped altitude to maintain visibility and slowed her airspeed slightly, just enough to stay within safe parameters. Her voice crackled over the radio. Adjusting route due to shifting wind. Estimated arrival delayed by 4 minutes. Her tone was calm, professional. The rest of the flight was tense but manageable. She never panicked. She didn't try to be heroic. She flew smart. When she landed, the wheels touched down so gently that the tower crew watching through binoculars clapped without realizing it. Val was waiting for her on the tarmac. She said nothing for a long moment. Then, "That was the cleanest storm adjustment I've seen in a student in 5 years." Lila pulled off her headset, her face damp with sweat. "It was rough up there. You didn't fly through the storm," Val said. "You commanded it." That night, Lila stood on her rooftop again. The sky dark but full of stars. She had flown through the storm, alone, and come out stronger. Asterisk the following week, Lila stood in front of the flight examiner's office, clutching her completed flight log in one hand and her FAA exam results in the other. The air was crisp, the wind soft, and yet her palms were sweaty. She had passed every requirement on paper and in the sky, but this moment still felt monumental. She had dreamed of it since she was a little girl tossing paper planes across her bedroom. Now she was steps away from receiving her private pilot's license. Inside the small office, a middle-aged man with thick glasses sat behind a cluttered desk. He flipped through her logbook without expression. Flight hours simulator. Records, checklists, everything was in perfect order. Her solo flight had already been noted by instructors as textbook level. Still, he remained silent. Finally, he looked up. "You're 17? "Yes, sir," Lila replied. "You're younger than most applicants I see. And your instructors? Report mentions you flew through shifting wind patterns without guidance." "I adjusted altitude and rerouted slightly to maintain visibility and flight safety," she said. "It was a localized front moving faster than expected." The examiner studied her for a long beat, then leaned back in his chair. "I've had candidates with 20 more hours panic during weather shifts." "What made you stay calm?" Lila thought about her grandfather, about Colonel Forrester, about every minute spent in dusty garages and simulator chairs, about how many times she'd been told her dream was too big or too unlikely. "I didn't think about fear," she said. "I thought about the process, the training. That's what flying is. It's trusting yourself in what you've practiced." The examiner cracked a small smile. "Congratulations," he said, reaching into a drawer. "You've earned your wings." He handed her a crisp FAA-issued pilot's license with her name printed at the top. She blinked at it. Not because she didn't believe it was real, but because, for the first time, she felt like the sky truly belonged to her. Later that evening, she returned home to a full house. Her parents had prepared a small surprise balloons, a homemade Captain Lila banner, and her grandfather's favorite lemon cake. He gave her a long, tight hug that said everything he couldn't put into words. "I knew you'd do it," he whispered, "even when you were launching paper planes off the porch." But what moved Lila most was a small wooden frame on the kitchen counter. Inside, it was the original paper plane, the one she'd folded back in 5th grade, slightly wrinkled but still intact. Beneath it was a label typed by her grandfather. "The first flight." She stared at it, heart swelling. That simple sheet of paper, once laughed at, now sat beside her official license, a symbol of the journey from dismissed to distinguished. Week later, Colonel Forrester invited her to a private luncheon hosted by Skybright. It was small, mostly mentors and donors, but he had a surprise planned. After dessert, he stood and cleared his throat. "Before we wrap up, I'd like to share a quick story," he said. "A few years ago, I visited an elementary school and laughed at a paper airplane a student handed me. It looked odd, too long, too slow. I thought I knew better." He held up a photo of the very plane, but it flew straighter and farther than any I'd seen. That student was Lila Chun, and today she's one of the youngest licensed pilots in the country. The room applauded. Lila flushed, both proud and overwhelmed. He turned to her. "You didn't just prove me wrong. You proved everyone wrong who ever thought dreams should fit a mold." After the event, an older pilot approached Lila. "I've flown cargo jets for 25 years, he said, "and I've never been as composed under pressure as you were during your solo storm run." She thanked him quietly, but inside, she knew this was only the beginning. She wasn't flying just for herself anymore. She was flying for every kid who had ever been underestimated. The National STEM Futures Conference was held that spring in Washington, D.C., a prestigious gathering of educators, engineers, and aviation leaders from across the country. Colonel Forrester had been invited to deliver a keynote address on the importance of early mentorship in aviation. The audience was packed. Pilots in dress blues, university deans, scientists, and students with wide eyes and notebooks open. As he stepped onto the stage, the colonel scanned the crowd. His speech was ready, but he had no intention of giving the one they expected. Today, he began, "I want to talk about a paper plane." Laughter rippled gently through the crowd, but Forrester remained serious. "Years ago, I visited a fifth-grade classroom. I handed out paper, asked the students to fold their best aircraft. Most of the kids made the usual designs, but one girl, quiet, focused, handed me something different. I laughed. I thought it would nosedive. I was wrong." He paused, letting the room quiet completely. That plane flew straighter, farther, and more balanced than any other. That girl's name was Lila Chun, and what I didn't realize that day was that I had just witnessed genius in folded paper. A murmur of recognition passed through the audience. The name had started to circulate recently in flight training circles and aviation blogs. Youngest private pilot in her state. First Asian American teen to complete Skybright's elite co-pilot course. People were starting to take notice. But Lila didn't just build planes on paper, the colonel continued. She built herself through hours of study, resilience, and grace. And today, she joins us here, not as a student, but as a licensed pilot. He stepped aside and motioned toward the wings of the stage. Lila appeared, dressed not in a suit or school uniform, but in a flight jacket with her name patch stitched proudly on the front. Her hair was tied back, her steps confident, and in her hand, folded perfectly, was that paper plane. The crowd rose in a standing ovation. Cameras clicked. Students cheered. One girl in the front row whispered to her mom, "She looks like me." Her mother smiled and squeezed her hand. "She flies like no one else." Layla took the podium, adjusted the mic, and looked out over the sea of faces. Her voice was clear, calm, just like in the cockpit. "When I was younger, I used to think dreams had to be loud, that people had to see them to believe them. But the truth is, some dreams start in silence. Mine started with folded paper, late nights in a garage, and a belief that even if the world didn't see me, the sky might." The room fell still. My first flight wasn't in an airplane. It was in a classroom. That paper plane showed me what it meant to build something that lifts. And thanks to people like my grandfather and Colonel Forrester, people who saw beyond the surface, I didn't just learn how to fly. I learned how to believe. As she stepped back, Forrester rejoined her and lifted the original paper plane for all to see. "This," he said, "reminds me every day. Never underestimate quiet brilliance." After the ceremony, reporters swarmed her. Her photo appeared in several national magazines under headlines like "Teen Pilot Breaks Barriers." With paper plane past, from silence to soaring, the rise of Lila Chun. But it wasn't the applause or headlines that stayed with her. It was a moment at the end of the event, when a young boy approached her, holding his own crumpled paper plane. "Do you think I can be a pilot too?" he asked shyly. She knelt down, smiled, and handed him hers. "If I could fly from this," she said, "so can you." The boy's eyes lit up as he held the wrinkled symbol in his hands. And for Lila, that moment, more than the license, the speech, or the ovation, was her truest full-circle flight. Asterisk. 2 years had passed since Lila Chun first earned her pilot's license. She was now 19, a flight instructor in training, and an engineering student at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. But even as her own future took flight, she never forgot what it felt like to be the quiet girl at the back of the room, easily dismissed, easily overlooked. And so she made a vow to make sure no dreamer ever felt invisible the way she once had. Every month, Lila returned to community schools, some rural, some inner city, carrying her flight gear and a stack of blank paper. She would unfold her story in classrooms, just like the one where hers began. She never showed up in uniform, never led with her title. She'd simply say, "Let's build something that flies." One by one, kids would sit up straighter. They didn't expect a young Asian girl to walk in and talk about torque, yaw, and G-forces with the fluency of a commercial pilot. They didn't expect someone who looked like their sister or neighbor to have trained in real aircraft or logged solo hours in crosswinds. But by the end of her talk, they didn't just believe in her. They believed in themselves. At one of those visits in a small town in Montana, a girl named Haley approached her after class. "I thought flying was just for people with money," she whispered. "But you make it seem possible." "It is," Lila said. "All you need is discipline, passion, and someone who sees you." That same week, Lila worked with Colonel Forrester and Skybright to establish a new scholarship fund, the Paper Wings Project. Its goal was simple: find young dreamers in unlikely places and give them the wings they needed. Applications poured in. Some came with photos of cardboard planes and garage-built gliders. Others came with essays about watching the sky from back porches or tracking airplanes with free apps because they couldn't afford real training. Lila read each one with care, often late into the night, between classes and flight labs. She saw herself in those kids, not just in their dreams, but in their questions. Can someone like me really fly? Yes, they could. And she was going to prove it. Meanwhile, her own career was soaring. She passed the FIA exam to become a certified flight instructor and began training new pilots, many of whom were older than her. Some were hesitant at first. A few even doubted her credentials. But when she stepped into the cockpit, any doubts evaporated. She taught with precision, calm under pressure, and never once raised her voice. One student, an ex-military engineer, called her the most collected person I've ever flown with. Yet no matter how high she flew, Lila never let go of her roots. She still kept her original paper plane, now sealed in a clear case in her dorm room, next to her first logbook and a photo of her grandfather, who had passed away the previous winter. On his last day, he had gripped her hand tightly. "You're flying farther than I ever could," he'd whispered. "But remember, lift someone else every time you rise." Those words became her mission. Years later, when Lila was invited to deliver a commencement address at her former high school, she stood at the podium and pulled the plane from her flight bag. "This," she said, holding it high, "was once laughed at. But it flew straighter than anything else in the room. And so did I." The audience went silent. Then, thunderous applause. She looked out at the students, their faces young, uncertain, full of questions, and smiled. "You don't need permission to dream," she said. "You just need the courage to launch." As she left the stage, a sea of hands reached out for her. Not just for an autograph, but for hope. Lila Chun, once the quiet girl with the odd paper plane, had become something far greater than a pilot. She had become a symbol for anyone who had ever been underestimated, ignored, or overlooked. And she would keep flying, not just for herself, but to carry others too.